Without the ones like you, who work tirelessly to keep things running, everything would suddenly stop. Hospitals, factories, schools, and power plants, they all depend on you. No matter the weather, emergency, or time of day, you're the ones who get it done. At Grainger, we're here for you with professional-grade industrial supplies. Count on real-time product availability and fast delivery. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
History as it happens, May 14th, 2024. Recovering Kennan.
I would like to say that it seems to me doubtful these two alliances can continue to serve for the long-term future. NATO could, but I don't think it would be acceptable to the Soviet Union.
This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States.
George Kennan's containment formed the basis of U.S. foreign policy toward the Soviet Union. It collapsed in 1991. Russian nationalism did not disappear. And today, a revanchist autocrat rules the Kremlin. Should containment make a comeback? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Anybody thinking about a new or old or contemporary strategy toward Russia, you can't do it without turning to Kennan. He is the dominant figure really for much of the 20th century in this regard. So the shadow that he casts is a very long one. You know, that can be good or bad. I think you could have a Kennan straitjacket in some ways and kind of keep thinking as he thought in the 1940s. But at the same time, it's my conviction that Kennan offers us a lot of useful ideas.
Kennan is a spectacle. There's a concept of George Kennan, which partly because we need a name for things. There's alliteration, Kennan, containment. I think sometimes more is made of Kennan's, the brilliance of his policy or the originality of his policy than it really merits. I mean, containment is, in a way, a commonsensical notion.
The hearing will come to order. Today, amidst the rush of revolutionary developments in Eastern Europe, the Foreign Relations Committee, through its subcommittee on Europe...
On January 17, 1990, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee convened a hearing to discuss how the United States must adapt its foreign policy to a new Europe. Communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe as Gorbachev continued to negotiate a peaceful end to the Cold War. The hearing was chaired by Delaware Senator Joseph Biden.
And by the European Affairs Subcommittee.
And the esteemed figure who'd been invited to testify about the exciting yet uncertain future was George Kennan.
We should keep in close touch with the Soviet government in connection with the questions that are now arising from the momentous changes.
The architect of containment half a century earlier pondered a Europe without a Warsaw Pact and with a unified Germany. Now, these hadn't happened yet, but it was possible to see it coming. So what would then be left to contain? Would NATO even be necessary any longer?
I would like to say that it seems to me doubtful that these two alliances can continue to serve for the long-term future. NATO could, but I don't think it would be acceptable to the Soviet Union that the Warsaw Pact was to disappear and leave Germany united, the strongest military power in Europe, and in intimate military alliance with the United States. There are a great many people in Russia, and especially in the armed services, who would say that's equivalent to saying that we lost the war or that we didn't win it. It'd be very serious, put very serious strains on them. And all that sort of thing, I think, will have to be thrashed out, and it will take a long time.
And here is Senator Biden.
But people now, I'm fearful, and statesmen and foreign policy officers and elected officials who have a particular interest in foreign policy are tending, in the absence of some broader framework, not having any notion where this is, what framework we will be discussing things, and are saying, well, what's the future of NATO? Will this mean NATO will have to be dissolved? We read articles about, does this mean the threat has gone? Does NATO no longer have any validity? And that creates political movements within European countries, among minority parties and majority parties. And then what are we to do about unification?
Well, later that year, Germany would reunify within NATO, and NATO would continue to expand to other countries in the former Eastern Bloc. But no one at that early 1990 hearing knew that a little less than 2 years later, there'd be no Soviet Union anymore, or that in another decade, a former KGB lieutenant colonel named Vladimir Putin would be Russia's new president. Containment by 2000 seemed a relic of the Cold War, as President George W. Bush made clear at his first joint news conference with Putin in early 2001.
I said in Poland, I'll say it again, Russia is not the enemy of the United States. As a matter of fact, after our meeting today, I'm convinced it can be a strong partner and friend, more so than people could imagine.
Fast forward a quarter century, and Putin's Russia is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine. In an essay for the Wilson Quarterly, the historian Michael Kimmage writes, "Nothing ages faster than a given moment in international politics." According to the rules of rapid-fire transformation, the diplomat George F. Kennan's writing from the late 1940s, the outset of the Cold War, should no longer be relevant. Kimmage goes on to say, when Kennan wrote the X article in the Long Telegram, his statements about Soviet power and about what the United States should do in response to this power, Harry Truman was president of the United States and Joseph Stalin presided over the Soviet Union, which was not yet a nuclear power. Kennan lived long enough to comment on the post-Cold War world, and his writings and interviews from the 1990s retain their salience. Yet nothing Kennan ever wrote could compete with the X article and the Long Telegram, Kimmage writes. Both texts were rediscovered in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and the motif of the Cold War was once again common currency. If anything, Kennan's texts have been most intensively consulted by policymakers and others in the wake of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Kimmage says the United States and its allies may be returning to a containment strategy vis-a-vis Russia. Should they do this, Kennan's influence on U.S. policy will have extended from the late 1940s to the second decade of the 21st century. Now, I'll put a link to Kimmage's essay in my weekly newsletter. It comes out on Friday mornings. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or find History As It Happens on Substack. So back to the Long Telegram and the X article in Foreign Affairs. Kennan explained why the United States should seek to contain Soviet communism, rather than try to, say, militarily destroy it. President Truman adopted containment, and in March 1947, he called on Congress to provide aid to Greece and Turkey, the Truman Doctrine speech. But not just for the sake of Greece and Turkey. Truman linked their freedom from communist aggression to the rest of the world.
It would be an unspeakable tragedy if these countries, which have struggled so long against overwhelming odds, should lose that victory for which they sacrificed so much. Collapse of free institutions and loss of independence would be disastrous not only for them, but for the world.
Well, as one of our guests in this episode contends, Kennan was unhappy with Truman's remarks. They were open-ended, when, in Kennan's view, only certain parts of the world were worth confronting, the Soviet Union. Europe, for instance. Is it possible to apply George Kennan's ideas from the 1940s to Vladimir Putin's Russia, which does not possess the same power or ideological impulses as the USSR? Michael Kimmage teaches history at Catholic University. He is the author of Collisions, The Origins of the War in Ukraine and the New Global Instability. Frank Costigliola is a distinguished scholar of U.S. foreign policy at the University of Connecticut and the author of George F. Kennan, A Life Between Worlds, an authoritative biography of the man and his ideas that we're going to delve into right now. Michael Kimmage, welcome back.
Great to be with you, Martin.
Joining us from Oxford, England. More on that in a second. First, I want to introduce our honored guest, making his debut on the show, Frank Costigliola, historian, biographer of George Kennan. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Martin. It's an honor to be here, and an honor to be here in the same program as Michael.
Michael Kimmage, you're there for your book tour.
I'm peddling my wares over here.
I get down to business quickly on my podcast, but I just want to allow you both to, well, you're meeting each other, so to speak, over Zoom for the first time. You're both familiar with each other's work, but you've never made an acquaintance before.
That's true.
Michael, you were on the Russia-Ukraine desk at the policy planning staff?
That's true. That was the portfolio that I had for 2 years, 2014 to 2016. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
But that's exciting. That's very exciting.
George Kennan's policy planning staff.
Founding director.
That's right.
The same.
Michael Kimmage apparently was known as the next George Kennan. You are Michael Kimmage. To get down to business now, you are pushing this idea. You're pushing this idea that we need a new Kennan-like containment strategy, informed but not shackled by history, to deal with Putin's Russia. So how about we begin? Maybe we'll begin at the beginning, because not everyone is entirely familiar with George Kennan. We are talking about somebody who made his mark 75, 80 years ago, right? Frank, who was George Kennan briefly, and why was he important? Why was he in the position he was in the mid-1940s?
Well, Kennan was probably the most informed Russia expert in the U.S. government in the 1940s. The particular moment he's remembered for is 46, 47. And in February 1946, he was at number 2 in the Moscow embassy under Averell Harriman. Harriman is away in Washington. And people in the State Department responded to Stalin's so-called election speech on February 9th, 1946, saying, what's up with this guy? Why is Stalin being difficult? Why has the wartime alliance seemingly dissipated? And Kennan, who had been sending messages to Washington and had been largely ignored, and was also, as he often was, sick in bed with the flu. It was a Friday, Washington's birthday. And back in those days, I think the country is better off. We celebrated presidents' birthdays on the actual day. So this was Friday, February 22nd. It was the start of a 3-day weekend. And Kennan called in his long-suffering secretary and said, look, we have an important message to send off to Washington. And he dictated what became known as a long telegram, nearly 6,000 words, supposedly the longest telegram ever sent into the State Department. And in that telegram, Kennan laid out reasons why he thought the United States would have great difficulty in getting along with the Soviet Union and why it was necessary to contain, as I think he later expressed that. And he followed up this long telegram with an article in Foreign Affairs in July 1947. Kennan in 46, 47 laid out a policy of containment, saying that basically that the United States faced with 2 unattractive alternatives, either appeasing Russia and accepting Russian expansion or going to war with Russia. The United States didn't have to follow either of those 2 unattractive alternatives, but rather containment was a way to limit or stop or block the expansion of the Soviet Union. Then it gets into the weeds of by what means. Kennan, and there's also another part of his agenda here, and that was to get the hell out of Moscow. He was, at this point, anxious to leave Moscow, to get to Washington. Kennan was an extremely ambitious person, and he wanted to rise in the hierarchy, and he was from number 2 in the Moscow embassy to something else. And this long telegram and the Mr. X article were vehicles for not only shaping U.S. policy, but also fueling Kennan's rise in influence.
Yeah, the telegram, which I have in front of me here, the long telegram, writes like an essay, like a work of literature. Michael Kimmage, kind of an obvious question because you're a historian and your specialty is this part of the world, this era of history. So that is what would draw you to Kennan. But more than that, what drew you to Kennan in this context that we kind of still need him?
Well, I think for anybody thinking about a new or old or contemporary strategy toward Russia, you can't do it without turning to Kennan. He's the dominant figure really for much of the 20th century in this regard. So the shadow that he casts is a very long one. You know, that can be good or bad. I think you could have a Kennan straitjacket in some ways and kind of keep thinking as he thought in the 1940s. But at the same time, it's my conviction that Kennan offers us a lot of useful ideas for the present moment. This doesn't seem to me like any giant intellectual leap, almost a statement of the obvious. But exactly what Frank just described, that in 2024, I think to appease Russia would be unwise. To go directly to war with Russia would be equally unwise, of course, as was not quite the case when Kennan was coming up with the containment doctrine. Soviet Union was not then a nuclear power, but it became one, and Russia is certainly that in the present moment. Although I would draw a number of distinctions, which I'd be glad to get into, between the kind of territorial ambitions that the Soviet Union had circa 1945 and the kinds of territorial ambitions that Putin's Russia has today. Russia is once again expansionary, and I think that that runs counter to American interests in Europe and in the region. And so something has to be done. And that thing which has to be done, I can call by no other name than containment. So for me, it's a return to Kennan, but I hope not a mindless repetition of his by now 70-year-old ideas or 75-year-old ideas.
Well, Frank, is it possible to apply ideas that are this old and came at a different time in a different context to what's happening now?
Kennan is a spectacle. There's a concept of George Kennan, which partly because we need a name for things. There's alliteration, Kennan, containment. I think sometimes more is made of Kennan's, the brilliance of his policy or the originality of his policy than it really merits. I mean, containment is, in a way, a commonsensical notion. One reason that long telegram, it was circulated actually on March 5th, 1946, the day, coincidentally, that Churchill had made his Iron Curtain speech. The long telegram was circulated to every diplomatic post around the world. The reason it had such currency is that it was a very persuasive statement, and I really underline that, a very persuasive, emotionally evocative statement, also nominally or in part rational. It was both rational and emotional, that was like pushing on an open door. American policy was already moving in that direction. And if George Kennan had never existed, American policy might not have had the name of containment, but it would have moved probably in the same direction at that point in 1946 and 1947. So in terms of applying it to today, as Michael said, it's kind of a commonsensical middle ground of trying to limit your adversary without getting into too dangerous a confrontation. I would say one other thing, though, that I think it's important that I didn't see, though, in the Wilson Quarterly essay, which was excellent. But Kennan believed that containment was kind of an if-then proposition. If the Russians were contained, then he did not believe it should be a static policy. He believed if the Russians were contained, then the United States should try to move toward negotiations and toward diplomacy to ease tensions. Because a key concern of Kennan's throughout his life, remember, this is somebody who lived to 2005 and was active in terms of writing on the political scene until the late 1990s. Prime concern of Kennan was the prospect of nuclear war, which is something we need to, in a way, you don't mention that in polite society, but the destruction of nuclear war would outclass, outdo, exceed far anything in terms of political gains or losses. And that was something very much on Kennan's mind.
I completely agree with that. And although in the Wilson Quarterly essay that's not explicitly mentioned, I indicate at the end a hope that the U.S. and Russia can achieve rules of engagement, which I think is different from a negotiated settlement to the conflict in Ukraine, but is very much in that spirit. And it's, I think, to me, one of the additional attractions of containment is that it leaves room for precisely that. It's not a zero-sum, ultimate violence, unconditional surrender type approach. To the contrary, that's something Kennan was really trying to avoid. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that for the present moment. But the other point I wanted to add about Kennan in terms of him being a possible role model, as he has been now for multiple generations of American diplomatic thinkers and strategists, is that Kennan had a very refined understanding of the Soviet Union, and he weaves that into the long telegram and into the X article. He paid very close attention to what the Soviet Union was. I don't think he was right on every point, but he really tried. And he tried to link what the Soviet Union was as a political entity to whatever American strategy or American foreign policy should be. Now, I think there are lots of distinctions between Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union and Vladimir Putin's Russia. And so we have to, in that sense, not imitate or not rewrite Kennan. We have to think anew, but I think he offers us a method for doing so, that really careful scrutiny of countries that are not the United States.
Kennan knew Russian culture, Russian people. I mean, we don't have to get into this, but one of the reasons that Kennan was so horrified by the Stalin regime is that it forbade ordinary, innocent contact between Russian citizens and foreigners such as himself.
Whatever one thinks of Kennan's ideas today, I think the point is, Michael Kimmage, he wanted to understand the world the way the Soviet Union understood the world. We can get into whether he read it correctly, but first, just a couple remarks about a point Frank made. Odd Arne Westad, the historian, his book, The Cold War, I'm holding here, page 91, Kennan's message was more a summing up of where many U.S. policymakers were already heading than an innovative policy prescription. It was also contradictory, writes Westad. The Soviets were inherently aggressive, but also able to compromise. But for officials hungry for ways of explaining an increasingly complicated world, it resonated. Context is critical. Which Kennan are we talking about? Frank, you mentioned that as he got older, he still continued to write. I think in the 1990s, he was an opponent of, or a skeptic of, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe.
Publicly in the New York Times, and privately writing a correspondence with his good friend Strobe Talbot, who, of course, was a Russia guy in the Clinton administration.
Kennan was not a militarist either. That came after he left the scene, and his position was taken by Paul Nitze in the early Cold War. He militarized U.S. policy towards the Soviets. But let's just briefly go over what was the state of U.S.-Soviet relations in 1946. When did the Cold War actually begin? When did it become apparent that the wartime alliance was going to fall to pieces? For instance, had the Soviet Union consolidated control over Eastern Europe yet in 1946?
The British Embassy in Washington, very in touch with what was going on. The British Embassy in Washington reported back to London 2 days after Roosevelt's death that, quote, everything here has changed. American policy toward Russia changed. American policy toward Russia during the Roosevelt administration was largely in the hands of Franklin Roosevelt, who kept the State Department, including Ambassador Harriman and certainly Kennan, at arm's length. And Roosevelt believed he had his own understanding with Stalin. We go into that. But American relations changed after Roosevelt died. The Truman administration is a famous conversation between Truman and Molotov. I believe it's April 23rd, 1945, so only 11 days after Roosevelt died, in which basically Truman told Molotov the United States is not going to put up with Russian domination over Poland, something that Roosevelt was willing to accept, at least for a transition period.
Well, the Red Army was in Poland already, but yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. So that was, that's a thing. That's exactly the thing. That was something Roosevelt recognized because of a variety of factors. It was the Russians that liberated Eastern Europe from the Germans, not the United States. So I regard that period, April 45 to basically March, April 1946, as the time when the formation of the Cold War. There's Kennan's long telegram, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, which was March 5th, and Stalin's so-called election speech of February 9th, 1946, all of which, and this is, I think, key, all of which put an ideological patina on great power rivalry and made it harder to reconcile. If ideologies are involved, it's more emotional, and it becomes, as I said, difficult to resolve things. At least people think it's more difficult to resolve things.
From Washington's vantage point, there are just a lot of ambiguities about the Soviet Union. And although Kennan was synthesizing a coalescing consensus, that's a good thing for a diplomat to do. You don't want to be 180 degrees away from where the capital city is going. And Kennan was canny in that regard. He also cut through some of the intellectual ambiguity, I think, that people in Washington were laboring under in 1945, 1946, 1947, that this was no longer the wartime alliance, although that was, of course, very much in recent memory. And Eisenhower had certain philo-Soviet elements, sort of appeared with Zhukov and could seem like a pal. And then there was the old American skepticism about what the Soviet Union was as such, this atheist communist superpower. And then this very new role for the Soviet Union in Eastern and Central Europe, where, vis-a-vis where the Soviet Union was in 1921, it's, much, much further to the West. And so I think American minds were struggling to figure out what was going on. And Kennan's skill really was the cogent presentation of, Stalin is this ambitious, but he's not going to take over the world. He's this aggressive, but he's not maybe ultimately aggressive. There are things that we can live with. There are things that we have to confront. But his skill was as much stating a strategic course as it was just presenting the world as it appeared. And I think there he was, pretty much on target.
Because the long telegram was stated with such persuasive force, and really Kennan, in a way, overreached. You talked about the militarization of the Cold War. That seemed like a logical response if the Soviets were, as he put it in the long telegram, a fanatical political force committed to destroying the U.S. government, destroying America's position in the world, and destroying everything moral and decent. It was an existential threat. Kennan presented it as such. Because of the force of that statement, people like Chip Bolin, who's in the State Department, another major Russian expert, said, in response to the long telegram, it says, well, we no longer really have to debate what Russia's point of view is or what Russia's ambitions are. This settles it. This provides an explanation. The other thing about the long telegram, which is interesting, is that Stalin, I think, is mentioned just twice, and that in passing, because Kennan presented, as part of this, presenting Soviet Union not as a government led by ambitious, cruel people, as Stalin was. It's still government led by people. But the long telegram presented the danger as what he called a fanatical political force, a fanatical political force. And then in the Mr. X article, he presented the Soviet Union as this mechanical automobile. Neither a fanatical political force nor a toy automobile, that's going on its own, can you reason with, can you compromise with, can you negotiate with? So it was like part of the force of those two documents was that it kind of dehumanized the Soviet leadership, the Soviet Union, dehumanized the Soviet Union and presented the threat as abstract and scary.
He also did think, though, the Soviets would be open to compromise if the U.S.
And that's the thing. That also, let me just say, the long telegram is kind of a bait and switch because Kennan presents this terrible, terrible danger. And then at the end, when he says, okay, now what should we do about this? He says, well, we don't really have to get that excited about it. In fact, we need to approach this calmly. And Kennan says, well, we need to help rebuild Western Europe. That's a major thing, and get our own society in order. And it's interesting that Dean Acheson, in his memoir, I just looked at this a few days ago, in his memoir, Dean Acheson talks about the long telegram as having a very effective prescription of the danger, laying out the danger of the Soviet Union. But then Acheson, who again is very influential, right, in terms of laying out U.S. Cold War policy, Acheson says, well, Kennan's recommendations for what to do were not very helpful because that's not where Acheson's head was at. He was more in terms of like building up NATO and kind of more of a militarized response.
I can't resist pointing out that Kennan very much valued having the role of a prophet, and he imitated in the writings of a figure from an earlier generation, Henry Adams, who was also, like Kennan, a great historian, a great writer, a great thinker, a great mind, but who was, sort of a guru or a prophet of ages to come. And I think that's part of Kennan's appeal. It's part of his charisma. But exactly as Dean Acheson was, I think, at that time suggesting, there's something, obfuscating and a bit mystical about Kennan, which is very interesting in the memo form to be able to get that across. And that means that the NHTSA interpretation of Kennan is probably correct in its terms, and Kennan's interpretation of Kennan is also correct in its term. The more military and the more political readings of Containment, and the problem is the sort of instability of argument in the documents themselves, but it makes them great to teach.
This context is so important because we must understand motivations and ideologies and aims. It's always critical in international affairs, even if it is often impossible to do that. We're having this problem today. So if we're going to try to apply Kennan to Putin, Michael Kimmage and I have talked about this several times on the show. What's going through his head? How does the Russian autocracy actually function? What is he really after in Eastern Europe? Is it just Ukraine or something else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You get my point. Did Kennan get it right? He described the Kremlin's view of the world, or view of world affairs, I'm using his term here, as neurotic, informed by centuries of never having a friendly neighbor. Now you add to that this Marxist-Leninist ideology that saw conflict with the capitalist powers as inevitable. Also, the capitalist countries had their own internal conflicts worthy of exploitation by the USSR. But, there's another way of looking at this, that the Soviet Union, well, it was the Tsarist Russia first, 1914, but the country invaded twice by Germany, 1914, then 1941 Operation Barbarossa. The second time laid waste to the Soviet Union, 25, 30 million people killed, right? Their consolidation of power, however awful for those countries in Eastern Europe, was a buffer zone, not an offensive operation, but a defensive one. That really wasn't a question. Michael Kimmage, you're used to my word salads, but you guys can try to unpack that.
Obviously, the German invasion and occupation, good parts of the Soviet Union were devastating. Incredible number of people killed and property destroyed and so forth. Stalin came out of World War II, famously at the Potsdam Conference in 1945 and said, these people will be back within 15 or 20 years. That you can't keep these people down. Stalin saw all the underground factories and so forth and thought that Germans are dangerous. And so that made Stalin, and this is really clear in the Tehran and Yalta conferences, made Stalin give a high priority to cooperation with the United States and Britain, trying to have a post-war alliance, contain Germany and Japan, and prevent yet a third German invasion. And that was also, as you pointed out, a reason for wanting to have a secure buffer area in Eastern Europe. Again, that was a price Roosevelt was willing to pay, at least for what he called a transition period allowing Russian control over Eastern Europe. But that also, it's important to emphasize here that Russian control over Eastern Europe was not absolute during the period 46, 47. There was free elections, or pretty free elections in Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Historians believe, based on records of Politburo, that the real Russian crackdown in Eastern Europe, when Stalin started not tolerating any kind of dissent from countries in Eastern Europe, came after the beginning implementation of the Marshall Plan. When Stalin saw how eager the Poles and the Czechs and other countries were to accept Marshall Plan aid, and he saw that his empire in Eastern Europe could slip away very easily because of America's economic clout.
Now, he forbid those countries from joining the Marshall Plan.
Correct. Russians also left Paris, where Kennan was, helping to organize the parameters for what would become the Marshall Plan. This is the summer of 1947, and it's after that that the Common Form was instituted and kind of controlled the Eastern European communist parties, and really the crackdown began. So, it's tit for tat. If we talk about how we get from 1945 to 1948, 49, it's punch and counterpunch, or step and counterstep, that leads to a worsening situation, which is what I'm worried about today. There's two sides, more than two sides. Tough action can lead to tough counteraction, and does.
Yeah, Michael Kimmage, I'll briefly pose my question to you again. I mean, this has been a debate among historians. Just how expansionist was the Soviet Union? How interested was the Soviet Union in exporting their way of life on other countries? Archie Brown, great British historian, has argued that by a certain point, definitely by Brezhnev's time, that really wasn't a priority anymore. They were just trying to hang on to power in their own country.
Well, I think American policy here is paradoxical, and to me paradoxical for understandable reasons, because the nature of the challenge was so difficult to interpret. On the one hand, sort of the first half of the paradox, exactly as you're saying, Martin, the Soviet Union is seeking a buffer zone, which makes perfect sense, to keep Germany down or to keep Germany at bay, to prevent future threats from the capitalist West. However, Stalin might have characterized that, but there was absolute consensus in the Soviet system about establishing that buffer zone. And as much as the U.S. complained about it and didn't like it, FDR does sign on to that project in some way, maybe Churchill more than FDR at Yalta, but, FDR doesn't tear it down. And Truman, who really didn't like this setup, is not able to do anything about it. So it's not as if the U.S. pursued a rollback policy of getting the Soviets out of Eastern Europe, in part because they were already there, but in part because it just was too much, really, for the U.S. to contest a Soviet buffer zone. If we fast forward, as you were indicating a moment ago with Brezhnev and Archie Brown, if you fast forward to 1975, the U.S. completes the Helsinki Final Act with the Soviet Union and agrees on the borders of Europe, which was de facto agreeing to a Soviet buffer zone across the Warsaw Pact. So, what U.S. policy says it is, which is against spheres of influence, is not what it is in reality in this regard, because I guess it was just too difficult to oppose. That's sort of one half of the problem. The other half of the problem, and this I think is where Kennan is correct, is that it's one thing to say that the Soviet Union wants and perhaps needs a buffer zone. It's another thing to know where that buffer zone ends. And for the Soviet Union, it certainly included West Berlin. They would have been delighted to bring West Berlin into that buffer zone. Probably on some level, it included a neutral West Germany, if that could have been configured, if it could have been possible. And this is what the US government had to worry about a lot, especially pre-Marshall Plan. If any of the big communist parties of Western Europe had come to power, you would have had an entirely different continent. Can you imagine a France or an Italy that would have been pro-Soviet or even potentially a part of the Warsaw Pact? I'm sure Moscow would have been thrilled with that as a possibility. Soviet Union is also using covert action to try to generate those outcomes, in the end unsuccessfully. But there too, I think a containment strategy was necessary. You don't know how big the buffer zone is supposed to be, and it's reaching pretty far, in theory at least, into Western Europe. And that's not something I think that the U.S. could have dealt with just with indifference or neutrality. So I would, sort of be mostly with Kennan in terms of his assessment.
Certainly, that's the purpose of the Marshall Plan. The purpose of the Marshall Plan is to counter, as you point out, the largest political party in Italy is the Italian Communist Party. The largest single party in France is the French Communist Party. So it's to counter the influence of those parties and to encourage the development of socialist and Christian democratic kind of parties, particularly in those two countries. I would also say, though, with regard to that Soviet sphere, kind of an interesting aspect of Kennan's ideas is what he stressed a lot in the 1950s, namely disengagement. Disengagement was kind of rollback. John Foster Dulles talked about rollback, but how are you going to accomplish that? Disengagement was rollback through diplomacy. Kennan gave a series of lectures, and most famously the Wreath Lectures over the BBC in December 1957, in which he advocated step-by-step negotiation between the United States and the Soviet Union for a mutual military pullback from Germany, and Kennan hoped eventually from Europe itself. Kennan always had this kind of vision of Germany being a united, neutral Germany, lightly armed. That was his expectation anyway. And that Europe itself, Kennan was in a way skeptical of U.S. long-term military occupation or bases in Western Europe. He thought that in the long term, Europe should be, both Eastern and Western Europe should be free of superpower heavy influence, and also because that was confrontation in the heart of Europe. Again, Kennan's fear that something could get out of hand and that Soviet-American rivalry could lead to a war.
Just to add a point, is the intellectual foundation for Kennan's opposition to NATO expansion later on. And Frank, your memory may be clearer on this point than mine, but I seem to recall Kennan having written in the New York Review of Books or somewhere else that German unification even wasn't the best idea because it concentrates too much power in German hands and sort of disbalances Europe. And so I think he was, sort of thinking through other structures for decades, and then NATO expansion comes along, and for him is very much the wrong answer to the problem of how to achieve a balanced, sustainable Europe. And one has to say in retrospect that Kennan was onto something, because look where we are at the present moment. I personally would not argue that it's a function of NATO expansion. All I would argue is that we collectively after 1991 didn't get the right recipe, and we're in a pretty catastrophic state at the present moment. So it's a good time in that respect to revisit the thinking of Kennan and to see the kind of alternative Europe he was speculating about.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that, Michael. I'm glad to hear that you also think 1991 was kind of a missed opportunity.
Absolutely.
There's fascinating, actually, I wrote an article on this in Foreign Affairs in January 2023. There's fascinating correspondence between Kennan and Strobe Talbott in the 1990s. Many people thought that expansion of NATO was not a good idea. And in fact, that NATO itself, like the Warsaw Pact, was perhaps a Cold War artifact that should be replaced by a European-wide security organization that would hopefully begin to really integrate Russia into the West, in which the United States could join. Kennan very much believed that was the case. And then when that did not happen, partly because they think NATO has almost always been an effective instrument or vehicle for U.S. influence. NATO was kept and then expanded. Kennan was very much against that. And so in this correspondence with Strobe Talbott, and particularly in 1997, Kennan is very eloquent about the dangers of expanding NATO. Also, there's a passage in this correspondence with Talbott concerning Ukraine. Kennan brought up, I don't know if this is in your book, Michael, I didn't see it in the index, Operation Sea Breeze, which was a series of naval exercises in the Black Sea, U.S. naval forces, other NATO naval forces. Russia was invited, but angrily said it was not going to participate, and Ukrainian naval forces. And so this went forward, and Kennan said, well, this is their quote, Kennan said to Talbot, how can we persuade the Russians that the expansion of NATO is not deleterious to Russian security interests when we engage in this kind of military or naval exercise in the narrow waters of the Black Sea, which Russia has always been very concerned about. So this is 1997, so way before 2014. This is something Kennan was concerned about.
Gorbachev was not in love with NATO expansion, but he agreed to it in Germany in that treaty that was signed, 89-90. Mary Elise Sarati's written a great book about this.
Right.
But he also needed money. Yeltsin did not like NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, but he went along with it. He also needed money. There's NATO expansion, and then there's NATO expansion to Ukraine, which is an entirely different matter in the eyes of Vladimir Putin. But, Michael, your book doesn't deal with the NATO debate directly, head on. You include it, but you were not preoccupied with it.
Correct. My book is an effort to explain one thing, and that's Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, in the scheme of things, for Russian strategic culture, for Putin's rhetoric, certainly, NATO is a very important matter indeed. It figures in a lot of Putin's speeches recently, over the years, and is clearly a neuralgic issue, as CIA Director Bill Burns noted when he was in Moscow as U.S. ambassador to Russia. All of that is true. All of that is part of the landscape. It's part of the larger story. But I think it gets one not at all far in terms of explaining Putin's motivations to invade in 2022. First of all, Ukraine was nowhere near close to joining the alliance in 2022. It's my conviction, this is only a hypothetical, I have no good evidence for this, but if Putin had pulled back in February 2022 instead of invading, I think he could have gotten some fairly substantial concessions on the part of the West, maybe not the United States, but European countries about Ukraine, NATO, European security. If it was about those issues, Putin had other means at his disposal, not for resolving them perfectly on his terms, but for making progress for Russia. I think the motivations for the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 have a lot to do with Ukraine itself, the configuration of Ukraine as it was under Volodymyr Zelensky in 2021, 2022, unfinished business from Russia's perspective going back to 2014, has a lot to do with the annexation of Crimea and some very real military problems that creates for Russia just managing the annexed territory of Crimea. And, if we take also Putin at his word about NATO, we need to at least factor in everything he says about culture, history, and civilization as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. And these are the major speeches and articles, not speeches, but articles that Putin writes in the summer of 2021, where NATO is either peripheral or just non-existent as the framing for this conflict. So I wouldn't want to take it off the table. I think it matters. I think it's important. And I think Kennan's words of warning were certainly prudential at the time and remain so in retrospect. I just wouldn't put it high on the list of explanatory factors for Putin's decision to invade in 2022. But I would like to approach that subject with humility and would ask all of my colleagues in the sort of academic and expert community to do the same, because we have no hard evidence on Putin's decision making. We simply don't know. Maybe we'll find out 20 years from now that it really was about NATO, or maybe we'll find out another explanation. But at the moment, we can't definitively say one way or another. So that's all just to say that my arguments of a moment ago were really a hunch and not much more than that.
We don't have a Kennan in Moscow.
Even if we did, I don't think a Kennan in Moscow, talented as he was, would have the answer to the question.
Although Kennan, I think he talked about his antenna. I mean, I think to a certain extent that's Kennan going on his hunches, but such as Kennan's credibility that those hunches were taken seriously by people in the U.S. government. Michael, I don't know very much about the origins of the Ukrainian war, 2022 and so forth, and you are the expert on that. But I think my sense is, and this is based mostly on my view of Kennan or my understanding of Kennan, what NATO expansion did was to help poison the atmosphere after 1991. And Strobe Talbot wrote to Clinton that Talbot was very much in favor of NATO expansion, but he admitted to Clinton virtually every strata of Russian opinion. This is in mid-1990s, 1995. Every strata of Russian opinion was against NATO expansion.
Now we have to finish what America started 4 years ago, welcoming Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic into our alliance. If you look around at who's in the room today, you can see that they are more than willing to be a good partner. They will make NATO stronger. They will make Europe safer. And in so doing, they will make America and our young people more secure. They will make it less likely that the young men and women in uniform who serve under General Shelton and the other generals here and their successors in the 21st century will have to fight and die because of problems in Europe. A new NATO can extend the blessings of freedom and security in a new century. With the help of our allies, the support of the Senate, the strength of our continued commitment, we can bring Europe together, not by force of arms, but by possibilities of peace. That is the promise of this moment, and we must seize it. Thank you very much.
So NATO expansion, in a way, I'm saying this a hunch on my part, but it was kind of, in a way, a symbol of, from the Russian perspective, of the West taking advantage of Russia's temporary weakness in 1991. Russia's always, in my reading of the history, insecure about being played for a fool or being played by the sophisticated West who thinks they could put something over on the peasants of Russia.
Encirclement, the fear of encirclement again.
Right. Yeah. That's certainly the case in the 40s and after. And anyway, this could be read. The expansion of NATO could have been read as an example of Russia being taken advantage of.
There's the security dilemma argument, which would put NATO front and center in explaining the 2022 invasion or the 2014 invasion. There's another framing that comes to mind, though. I don't know if it's at odds with the security dilemma explanation, but it's parallel to it, perhaps, which is that I don't think NATO presents, sitting in NATO member countries, I don't think NATO presents a threat to Russian security as such. I do think it's a defensive military alliance, Kennan's notion of paranoia as it applies to Stalin. to me, rings true somewhat when it comes to Putin and NATO. But I do think genuinely NATO is a threat to Putin's ego, and it's a threat to his vanity. That it's really Russia that should be calling the shots in Ukraine, at the very least, as Russia calls the shots in Belarus, and probably it's a few other countries where Russia should be calling the shots as well. And NATO is just, it's unaesthetic, it's unpleasing to Putin. Now, does it make a difference whether NATO frightens Putin or is an affront to his ego? In the end, it may not make a difference because it's what Putin decides to do on the ground that ultimately matters most. But I think it's really more vanity at issue there than acute fear.
I would not underestimate the impact of emotional reactions in influencing reason. Ego, vanity, those are very important things, whether you're a dictator or not.
Not just national interests, it's perceived national interests, what you believe is in your interest, which is why ideas like containment, through no fault of Kennan's, he can't be blamed for decisions that were made 20 years after he was in a position of power, but ideas like containment can lead to disasters like Vietnam. You know what, Michael Kimmage, what you were saying just now reminded me of something Mark Galeotti said when we discussed your book a few months ago. Putin does have this kind of 19th century spheres of influence worldview where you're either in my sphere of influence or you're in the opponent's sphere of influence. So NATO is not going to invade Russia, but if NATO is in the Baltics and Poland and the former Eastern Bloc and potentially in Ukraine, well, then he doesn't have those countries.
Ukraine now seeks to deepen its cooperation with the NATO alliance through a membership action plan. Your nation has made a bold decision, and the United States strongly supports your request. In Bucharest this week, I will continue to make America's position clear. We support MAP for Ukraine and Georgia. Helping Ukraine move toward NATO membership is in the interest of every member in the alliance and will help advance security and freedom in this region and around the world.
Right. No, I think that that's probably correct, although I think that there are lots of important gradations.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the Baltic republics in NATO is such a disaster for Russia, or was perceived that way in 2004 when it happened. The Russian response is relatively mild. Then, after all, Russia has Kaliningrad. It's kind of got its Baltic Sea port. It doesn't necessarily need Riga as well. But definitely for Belarus and Ukraine, which are in Putin's category of the sort of three original medieval Russian countries that belong to be together for historical and cultural reasons, there I think, the sphere of influence arguments intersect with arguments that for Putin are very sensitive on matters of culture and geography and history. So that creates something of a perfect storm. And he's willing to go out on a military limb for Ukraine, and I would presume for Belarus as well, in a way that he might not be in Poland, the Baltics, certainly Scandinavia, and, Moldova, the Balkans. That's kind of anyone's guess. And in a way, the problem of U.S. policy at the moment, I think we all know that Putin is committed to spheres of influence, whether these are a 19th century or a 21st century idea. They could be both. We know that Putin's committed to that. We just don't know where those spheres begin and end. And Putin himself may not know where those spheres begin and end. That's one of the terrifying ways in which, for him, spheres of influence are just a work in progress.
Because I want to go back to a really pivotal or important moment in the formation of Kennan's ideas and the containment policy. The first time this is manifest as an actual policy is the Truman Doctrine, the speech in, 47, Aid to Greece and Turkey.
One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
I think maybe even more important speech for the purposes of our conversation here is Truman's 1949 inaugural address, which covers international aid and donating knowledge to the developing world so they can develop free from coercion. And that, of course, means communism.
The United States is preeminent among the nations in the development of industrial and scientific techniques. The material resources which we can afford to use for assistance of other peoples are limited. But our imponderable resources in technical knowledge are constantly growing and are inexhaustible. I believe that we should make available to peace-loving peoples the benefits of our store of technical knowledge.
But I think implicit in that speech is Truman's understanding that socialism was appealing to people in the developing world, and the United States had to be proactive and offer an alternative to what you might call Marxism or socialism. This brings us back, again, a very long point. Thank you for hanging in there. Point I made earlier about the idea of containment. Rather than seeing Third World, as it was then called, Marxist revolutions or movements as directed from Moscow, part of a communist monolith, may have been more accurate to see them as local or indigenous movements in the era of decolonization especially, that saw Marxism or socialism appealing. So we globalize every conflict into this zero-sum ideological war between the West and the communist monolith, when in fact what was happening wasn't directed from Moscow, or was it? I mean, you guys would know better than I.
So a couple things.
Probably a lot of things there. That was a long question.
Okay. So first of all, the Truman Doctrine was March 12, 1947. Kennan actually was not very happy with that speech because Kennan thought, okay, aid to Greece and Turkey, that's important. Turkey's important. There's no Russian military threat to Turkey, but in the sense of there's no war going on. But Russia has requested, actually had gotten the assent of Churchill and Roosevelt for it in World War II, was joint control over the Dardanelles, which is obviously crucial. But after Roosevelt was gone and Churchill were gone, Britain and the United States said they were not going to favor joint control over the Dardanelles, Russia and Turkey. So buttressing Turkish resistance to any Russian pressure.
There's a geopolitical concern there, yeah.
Right, exactly. Okay, but Kennan thought, okay, aid to Greece and Turkey, that was fine. But what Kennan did not like was Truman's open-ended perspective with that speech that the U.S. would give aid to anyone around the world who was meeting internal subversion or basically communist aggression. Kennan thought, and this is really an important point for him, Kennan thought there were only really 5 areas of the world that were worth sacrificing for, or the United States had to worry about. The 5 major industrial areas, the United States, Britain, Central Europe, Russia, and Japan. Those are the important areas of the world. Kennan thought, basically, if Southeast Asia fell to the communists, so what? Kennan thought that major areas of the world, partly this is kind of racist supposition of what peoples are important, what peoples are not important. Containment applied to only a few major areas of the world, not the entire world. And that was the problem with the Truman Doctrine from Kennan's perspective.
The history of containment as a strategy has its shortcomings in Europe, but its best version of itself is definitely the version that runs from the late 1940s to 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which is such a vindication for containment. It vindicates the patience of the policy. It vindicates the non-extremism of the policy, but also vindicates the efforts made to hold the line, especially in a place like West Berlin. But where containment went off the rails pretty consistently was outside of Europe. And there's just a lot to mull over. You've referenced, Martin, the Vietnam War. I mean, Kennan was very eloquently opposed, and I would say courageously opposed to that war. But definitely, as you suggested, Martin, many of the people who were fighting that war thought that they were practicing containment. In doing so, the toppling of regimes in Guatemala, Iran, sort of extensive war crimes, a lot of the dark chapters of the Cold War, as chronicled in Westad's great history of the Cold War, really have to do with the applications or the misapplications of containment in the developing world, in the third world, beyond Europe, the post-colonial world, etc.
Yeah, always framed as foreign aggression. Vietnam was a civil war, but go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, we have to learn a lot from that and make sure, whether we're mulling over Kennan or just the legacy of containment, make sure not to repeat those mistakes. I personally don't have too much concern that we'll repeat those mistakes with Russia. I don't think that we're going to play a great game in the Sahel, even though, Russia sort of pushing out American military influence at the moment, but there's not too much incentive to sort of recreate the great game or to move wherever Russia moves in some counter direction. But there you might have more concern about misapplication of the lessons of containment to China and how the U.S. counters China and whether the U.S. is too extreme or too hysterical in terms of countering Chinese influence where it perceives it to be negative. That's a conversation I know, Martin and Frank, for another day, for another podcast. But when I think of Kennan and how not to apply Kennan, it's the global dimension that really leaps to my attention.
Frank, am I making too much of this nuance between a local Marxist indigenous revolution when I have to add, the Soviet Union did look at these opportunities or these incidents as opportunities to expand its influence, even if they weren't the driving factor behind the revolution, say in Central America or South America or wherever?
No, I think you're right. The only point I'm making is that to Kennan, this should not be a concern of U.S. foreign policy.
I think he was right about that. I just did a show about, or I read a book and did a show about, for instance, El Salvador, Reagan-era policy toward El Salvador, backing these vicious right-wing dictators because there was a violent Marxist revolution going on in that country. But the El Salvador Civil War was a disaster, and the United States made it worse. To what end? How is that in our national interest? Sorry, I'll stop preaching here.
Kennan frequently spoke out against U.S. interventions in the Third World. He spoke out against the war in Afghanistan, against the second war in Iraq, against the intervention in Somalia. These interventions were dissipating American treasure and American credibility.
All right, so my digressions are over here. The whole point of this conversation was applying Kennan to Putin's Russia. Russia's global ambitions are different than those of the USSR. Its strength is different. Its outlook is different. So how do we fit containment to, a much different country today? Even though there is, of course, Russian nationalism, one consistency.
Well, I'll limit myself to Europe because I think the global conversation, sort of Russia-China, Russia-Hamas, Russia-Iran, is just such a tangled, complicated story that I'll overlook it for the sake of trying to be as coherent as I can be about this question as it concerns Europe. So one thing to say is that Putin's Russia is not anywhere near as powerful as the Soviet Union was. It's different in nature. Probably the United States is not as powerful, relatively speaking, today as it was in the 1940s and 50s as well, which is also interesting to reflect on. And what Russia does not have now is the vehicle or instrument of communist parties or communist revolution. So I don't think, I guess you could cook up very extravagant scenarios where the AfD would come to power in Germany and would serve as a vehicle of Russian influence. But that to me seems, first of all, far-fetched, and it's just different from how things looked in Europe in the 1940s and 50s. So in that sense, in terms of differences, the challenge or the threat that Russia poses, Putin's Russia, is smaller in nature, and that should be factored in. That should be acknowledged directly. On the other hand, that's the good news. The bad news is that the Iron Curtain was a real thing. When exactly it forms is hard to say, and from a kind of bloodless perspective, despite the misery of many of the people living on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain was also kind of a good thing because you knew where it was. As Churchill himself said, right? From Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, he could sort of put geographical points on it. Now we have a hot war in the midst of Europe. It's a day on which we're having a conversation where Russia has just begun a huge offensive around the city of Kharkiv. So this is a war that's very much on the move. Russia's territorial ambitions are quite significant. Russia's now investing 8% of its GDP in defense. It's put itself on a wartime footing when it comes to shell production. It's outproducing the West in artillery shells by 2-1 at the moment. In that sense, the kind of threat or challenge that Russia poses is much more direct and immediate. If Russia begins to win the war, we're going to see millions of refugees pour from Ukraine. We're going to see lots of regional instability. We could see Poland and the Baltic countries entering the war directly on Ukraine's behalf, which would put NATO directly in the center of the war. Maybe those are a little bit fantastic as scenarios. I hope they are. But that's just putting us in a much more fluid, dangerous, unstable, difficult to manage war in Europe than was the case in the 1940s and 1950s. So the size and scope of the threat globally perceived from Russia is smaller, but the nature of the threat in Europe is worse. It's more difficult to handle. I don't know, maybe this is where the limits of applying Kennan come into view. I don't know if we can apply containment that well to unwinding a hot war. That's really not what it was designed to do. It was designed to hold a line that was not being militarily contested and to prevent it from becoming militarily contested. Unfortunately, we don't have those circumstances to work with. So, I'll have to think more about how to apply Kennan in that regard, because that's where past and present don't align.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I thought one of the most skillful parts of your book was in the conclusion when you talk about the possibility of Trump becoming president again in 2025. And of course, if that does happen, there's another aspect here, and that is could be a more serious development of Russia as a center for traditional Christian, traditional gender roles, traditional anti-modern, in some respects, anti-postmodern forces around the world, including in the United States. The AfD is strikingly, I understand, the single most popular party in Germany. And that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. And then Hungary and Poland. With Trump as president, things could move in that direction where the right-wing ideology, in a way, neo-fascist ideology, becomes more au courant in a way that may seem far-fetched now, but in that circumstance, with the United States being a very different kind of leadership could become significant.
In which case, to sum up on my end, if that comes to pass, we'll no longer be living in Kennan's world, and we'll probably need first of all, a new way of understanding the world that we're living in, no doubt a new set of strategic doctrines and strategic thoughts. We're still sort of vaguely in Kennan's world, but we may be exiting it.
Yeah, Michael, I think you're right, and I certainly don't want to downplay the fact that Russia is acting like a hostile power. Cyber warfare, espionage, assassinating dissidents and journalists, and now a hot war in Ukraine.
Yeah, we're dealing with a hostile and aggressive country, but we're also dealing with a country that has grievances, as we pointed out. I think, it's often, this is imperfect. I'll emphasize imperfect with a capital I. But it's also useful to kind of put the shoe on the other foot and see how things look. Now, imagine for a moment that, let's say, Venezuela had a military alliance with China. I mean, that's not totally far-fetched. And let's say, for whatever reason, Central American countries, one by one, started joining that Chinese-Venezuela alliance. Then let's suppose Mexico thought it might want to join that alliance as well. The United States would go absolute bonkers.
Yep.
Think about the American reaction today to Castro's cozying up to the Soviet Union 60 years ago, before you were born, okay? And still we have sanctions against Cuba because it's not a democracy. Hello? How many other countries are not democracies? So the point here is we could say NATO is a defensive alliance, but from the perspective of many other countries, it's advancing. It's expansionist.
Yeah, remember the Bush-Putin fishing trip they did? That's how long Putin's been around. They were meeting, actually, to discuss, among other things, a missile system in Poland. Right. And we tried to convince him you've got nothing to worry about, as if, a Russian system in Canada wouldn't have the same type of effect on our worldview.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think, the United States tend to regard ourselves as, of course, squeaky clean, or basically the United States is kind of the normative force in world politics. But for other countries, it doesn't quite always look that way.
America's got a whole lot of challenges. Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness. Ukraine has been a country in which Russia had enormous influence for decades, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. We have considerable influence on our neighbors. We generally don't need to invade them in order to have a strong cooperative relationship with them. The fact that Russia felt compelled to go in militarily and lay bare these violations of international law indicates less influence, not more.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, many of the American college students who are protesting Israel's war in Gaza simply do not understand why the United States continues to support the Jewish state. We're going to dive into that history next with Jeremy Surrey as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
Without the ones like you, who work tirelessly to keep things running, everything would suddenly stop. Hospitals, factories, schools, and power plants, they all depend on you. No matter the weather, emergency, or time of day, you're the ones who get it done. At Grainger, we're here for you with professional-grade industrial supplies. Count on real-time product availability and fast delivery. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.